In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the ignition coil boots on this Ford Flex with the 3.5 liter naturally aspirated engine. Let's get started. This being a V6, we have to access the rear bank by removing the intake. Once this is out of the way, both banks will look identical and it'll be easy to reach everything, but I want to show you the rear one. That way you can see the process of removing and reinstalling this intake correctly. Whereas this one, you don't have to do anything for it. It's just right here. So I'm going to skip over this one and I'll show you the more difficult side because the procedure applies to both once we get this out of the way. If you have an engine cover, go ahead and remove it. Ours is missing. So we're going to move on to removing the intake. First, grab this hose. This goes to the coolant overflow and just pull it aside like this. Then we have this vacuum line right here. Pull it out of the retainers over here, but be very careful because it's plastic, it's not rubber, so you don't want to snap it and break it. You'll have to replace it if you do. There we go. Now this is released from here. Now let's unplug some connectors over here. Start with this one, set it aside, and you have this line here. On the back side, right here, you have these tabs. You want to pinch them in, just like this. As you pinch it, you want to push it out like that. There you go. Set this aside also, but again, this is the plastic line, so don't go too far because it will break. Let's unplug the throttle body connection here. Sometimes you'll need a little prying device to help you pry the red lock. Press on the connector and slide it off. Now release the clamp that holds this intake tubing onto the throttle body. Make sure it moves. If you can't pull it off, probably needs to be unthreaded a little more. Okay, leave it just like this. Follow the intake further and you'll see that this hose for the PCV is connected to it, or this line. Move this clip back and forward, kind of like this. It should hold it in the unlocked position so you can pull this off and just set it aside for now. Right over here there's another clamp, 8mm socket also. Just loosen it up a little bit, unthread the bolt, and this should allow you to pull this assembly out of the way here. Okay, just like that. Looks like we have a hose attached over here. So I'm going to unplug it from here. This should be able to slide up now. Set this aside. Unclamp this hose, use some pliers, and twist the hose clamp this way so I can grab it. But once you get the hose clamp released, you should be able to pull the hose off. Sometimes these are a little tight, so just there we go. Once if you squeeze it enough, this one actually has a lock on it. So you can lock it in the open position and just leave it like that until you're ready to reinstall. A lot of times these rubber hoses will get stuck on here, so use something to very gently pry it, give it a couple twists, and it should break free and pop off here. There we go. Set that aside over here. Make sure the clamp doesn't fall off. Now we're ready to pull the intake off, and we just have to unbolt it at this point. There is one more hose connected to the backside, but we can't get to it until we pull it off a little bit. So there is a sequence to removing this intake. You start at this bolt right here, which is in the center, in the front, but towards the driver's side. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you jump over to the driver's side, skip over this one, 5, 6, and then go back to this one for 7. I'm going to break them free first using an 8mm socket, and then once they're broken free in this sequence, I'm going to pull them off completely. Okay, now let's remove the bolts completely. It's important to follow the sequence so that you don't potentially damage the intake. You don't want to crack it by accident. Okay, these don't come out, they stay in the intake. So right down here, between the throttle body and the intake, you'll see another 8mm bolt. You can actually easily reach it underneath the throttle body and break it free. We'll have to remove this one. This is the last thing holding the intake on. Okay, that's broken free. Okay, try not to drop the bolt. At this point, the intake should be unbolted and ready to pull up and out. If you have a lot of debris here, I know I have some leaves here, but they're not here, they're underneath, so I'm not going to worry about them yet. If you do have a lot of debris, like I said, just blow it off or vacuum it at this point. We can pull the intake up, and you're going to have to get this wiring out of the way here. Looks like it's clipped onto the intake. Pry the retainer out. Slide the intake back a little bit, and that's only so you can clear these hoses, lines, and wires, and then slide it up and forward, but don't go too far because we still have this hose at the back here. And to disconnect that easily, just grab some pliers, pinch the hose clamp, squeeze it, slide it off, and then move the hose off of here. You can use pliers or a little prying tool to help you slide it off. Set this aside. Now with the intake out of the way, we can see the rear half of the engine, which is perfect. Get an 8mm socket, break this bolt free, remove it all the way. Set that aside, pull back on this red tab. Sometimes they're a little stuck here, just from sand buildup. Grab a little pry bar or screwdriver to pop it free like this. Then that will allow you to press down on the connector, disconnect it, get any debris out of here if you have any. Grab the ignition coil, slide it up. There it is. Now to replace the boot, we'll do both, obviously, top and bottom. They come together. You just peel them off. Sometimes they'll be a little stuck here, but just pry them off like this and give the ignition coil a couple twists. That should slide it off just like this. Set this old one aside. Take the lower one off. To do that, you just grab it, twist it, and pull at the same time. Just like this. Be careful when you do this. There's a little spring in there. The new boot will come with a new spring, so this one will stay with the old boot, and we'll install a new one. Here's the new spring and the new lower boot. I'm going to put it in through the hole where the spark plug goes, and I'm just going to use a 1/4 inch extension. You can use anything else that you have, and I'm going to push it until it pops through just like that. This will actually lock it in. The two ends of the springs are wider than the center, and this is what transfers the spark or the power from the coil to the spark plug. So just make sure it's seated in there well. Then you want to take the ignition coil, slide this over. It should easily seat and lock on here. Perfect. Now take the new upper boot. Doesn't matter which direction you put it. It's just a round piece of rubber. Slide it over and press it to lock it in place. Let's install the ignition coil. Before you do this, I always recommend putting some silicone paste or dielectric grease on the end of it right here. You don't need a lot, but what this will do is, one, it's going to let the spark plug slide in here easier and let the boot seat fully. Second thing it's going to do is it's going to prevent moisture from building up on the tip of the spark plug and will not cause any corrosion. Slide it down, make sure it's seated all the way. There we go. Put the mounting bolt back in, thread it on, and bottom it out completely. Make sure it's nice and snug, but don't over tighten it. You don't want to break it. And then connect the connector. Make sure that you push it on until it clicks, and then don't forget to lock this into place. And at this point, you would do the same exact thing to the rest of the cylinders. Now let's get the upper intake on. Make sure all the gaskets are still in position. Mine are. Before we completely put it on, we need to reattach this hose at the back here. It'll be a lot easier to do it now rather than after this is already in. So make sure it's bottomed out completely. Just like that. Now let's grab some pliers, get that clamp on. Position it right about where it was before. Now we can line up the rest of the intake with the lower intake. Make sure you don't pinch any wires or hoses in here. Get these out of the way. There we go. That lines up perfectly right there. Manually start in the bolts so that you can make sure that not only are they not cross-threading, but if they all start in, you know you're perfectly lined up, so you have nothing else to worry about. Okay, one more over here, and one more back here. Okay, before I attach anything else, I'm going to tighten this down so that other than that hose in the back, nothing is putting pressure on it. Not that the hoses or the wires would put pressure on it, but I just want it to seat perfectly, and I want to know that it's installed fully. I'm going to snug these down with my 8mm socket, and then the sequence for this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then cross over 5, 6, and then back to the middle, number 7. Remember, there is one more bolt that goes underneath the throttle body all the way in the back on that bracket, but we'll worry about that later. That one is not part of the sequence. Just make them snug. I'm not torquing them yet. Double check the first few. Okay, now let's torque them to 89 inch-pounds in the same sequence, and then we'll do an additional 45 degrees after the 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds is about 7.4 foot-pounds. That's 89 inch-pounds for all of them, but I will go over it again because as with all rubber gaskets, the first few might loosen up as you tighten the last few. And because we have degrees involved to finish torquing them, you want to make sure that your base torque, which is a foot-pound number, is correct. If your initial torque or the base torque is not right, once you do the degrees, the ones that are not properly tightened will be off to a different final torque. I have a torque wrench that reads degrees, so I have it set to 45 degrees, but if you don't have this, you can just use a ratchet or a little breaker bar and go 1/8 of a turn. You can either mark the bolt or just visually look at it as you're turning. That's it right there. Same sequence. At this point, they're all torqued. You don't want to touch the bolts anymore. If you doubt yourself, you're going to have to loosen them up and start all over again. If you continue tightening or even loosening at this point, you completely ruin the procedure that we just did. And the final torque will be out of spec. Underneath the throttle body, if you follow it, it's very difficult to see, but there's going to be that bracket that had a bolt going through it. We removed it with an extension, slide that bolt in, get this started, bottomed out, and tightened down. Okay, that's nice and snug. Let's reconnect all the connectors and hoses around the throttle body here. Connect the throttle body itself. Make sure that clicks. You didn't hear it, I didn't hear it, but I felt it. Lock the connector in. Now let's put this hose back on this valve here. Lock it down and connect the electrical connector for it. Make sure that clicks. Next we had a vacuum hose over here. Slide that over, bottom it out all the way. Let's get this clamp back on here. Lock that hose on. This was just pointed down over here. This coolant hose that goes across was secured on these plastic retainers, and then this vacuum line, actually it's just a plastic line, secures itself onto the retainers on the fuel rail. Let's put the air intake duct back. Slide it over the air filter housing, and make sure that on the bottom this lip doesn't roll over. You want it to seat on the housing, just like this. There we go, press it on all the way. Now, on this side, put it over the throttle body. Once again, make sure it seats. All the way around, just like this. Give it a couple spins to ensure. This hose goes back on here. This one back on here. Make sure this clicks. Now with this situated properly, let's tighten up the two hose clamps. 8mm socket. One over here. Don't make them very tight, just snug. These strip out easily, and once they do, you have to replace it with a new one. Just like that. Perfect. Now if you had an engine cover, you'd put it back on. It goes onto these grommets here, but ours is missing, so we don't have anything to put back on.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.